Hey, I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
It's time to save the world. And I think I know where to start, because saving the world has kinda always been the goal on this channel from the very beginning, so where else to go but back to where it started. Back when I reviewed The Forest and the Trees by Allan Johnson in November of 2014, during the gosh darn Obama years. Well, let's take a nostalgic trip down memory lane and have a look at that first video.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at The Forest and the Trees, Sociology as Life, Practice, and Promise.
Oh god, that is just awful. Why is my camera shaking around like some sort of found footage horror film? Why is my script reading so terrible? Why did I record the audio with a frickin' potato held together with duct tape in a dream? Ugh. I was only 1 year old at the time, so I suppose I forgive myself for producing such a cavalcade of artistic and technical failures in that first video. But that said, the real question isn't why was that first video so bad, but actually why, of all books, did I choose The Forest and the Trees as the first book to review on my channel? Well, I did it because when it comes to, let's say, saving the world, I don't think anyone can really grasp the things we discuss here on this channel without first understanding the lessons of this book. We can talk about prison reform and police reform, labor history, military history, political and economic revolutionary texts, but none of that can really be understood without understanding how social systems work. And that requires the sociological perspective. And I guess that's why I chose to cover a sociology book first. But maybe you don't know much about sociology, and I wouldn't recommend going back to that first video. 2014 was a long time ago, especially in dog years, if you believe in that kind of thing. So I think it's time to have a second look at The Forest and the Trees, Sociology as Life, Practice, and Promise by Allan Johnson, Temple University Press, 2008. The key idea of this text is to explore and explain the sociological perspective. You know, as the subtitle of the text implies, Sociology as Life, Practice, and Promise. It's about how to think about and view the world and our place in it as a sociologist would, to think about the web of interconnectivity that drives our choices, our behaviors, our participation in the world around us. Referring to the title of the text, The Forest and the Trees, Johnson explains that understanding social systems is not about individuals, individual trees, for example, and it's not about systems, the forest, for example, but it's about the relationship between the two. It is about the forest and the trees. As he puts it, the empty space that separates individual trees from one another isn't a characteristic of any one tree, or the characteristics of all the individual trees somehow added together. It's something more than that, and it's crucial to understand the relationships among trees that make a forest what it is. Paying attention to that something more, whether it's a family or a university or a society, and how people are related to it, is at the heart of sociological practice. And that something more determines how we act and relate to one another within any given social structure. For example, throughout the book, Johnson refers to this concept of paths of least resistance, referring to paths that are created by resistance placed upon us by the people and the social systems around us, thus guiding our actions. The point is put well this way, where Johnson states, "We are always participating in something larger than ourselves, and if we want to understand social life and what happens to people in it, we have to understand what it is that we are participating in and how we participate in it." In other words, the key to understanding social life is neither just the forest nor just the trees, it's the forest and the trees, and how they're related to one another. So let's develop this sociological understanding, the understanding of us and social systems and what exists in between, by taking a look at the text in depth, starting with Chapter 1, The Forest, the Trees, and the One Thing. Before exploring the sociological perspective, Johnson first discusses its opposite, the individualist perspective, which so often dominates the way we tend to think about the world. He states, "If we think everything begins and ends with individuals, their personalities, life stories, feelings, and behavior, then it's easy to think that social problems must come down to flaws in individual character. If we have a drug problem, it must be because individuals just can't or won't say no. If there are racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, and other forms of privilege and oppression, it must be because of people who, for some reason, have the personal need to behave in racist, sexist, and other oppressive ways. If there is terrorism in the world, it must be because there are certain kinds of people, terrorists, who by their nature feel compelled to engage in terrorist behavior. In short, if evil consequences occur in social life, it is because of evil people and their evil ways and motives. And if I, like many folks do, look at the world through this individualistic way of thinking, I might hear the term Black Lives Matter and take it as an accusation of a personal failure. If you are telling me that Black Lives Matter, it must be because you think that I don't think that Black Lives Matter, that I'm racist. But I don't personally engage in racist behavior, so the term Black Lives Matter is not accurate. Reverse racism, even. And if you show me data about over-policing and over-sentencing based on race, and I still look at that information through an individualist mindset, I will just blame the individual black folks for making poor decisions, thus leading to those statistical disparities. Maybe they just have a bad culture or something. They need to pull their pants up and stop listening to that gangster rap or whatever. And if you demonstrate to me that these various studies show that the problem isn't with black people, but with the criminal justice system itself, then my individualist mindset will just continue to see the problem individualistically. It's not systemic racism, it's just bad cops and bad judges being individually racist. Don't let spoiled apples ruin the bunch and all that. Without a sociological perspective, my individualistic way of thinking just keeps reframing the problem into one of individual bad actors. As Johnson puts it, the solution to collective problems, such as poverty or natural disasters or terrorism, then becomes a matter not of collective solutions, but of an accumulation of individual solutions. Telling this or that black person to not jaywalk, telling this or that police officer to not use excessive force, telling this judge not to give out such harsh sentences, but never seeing the whole picture as systemic racism. Clean your room, bucko, is an important step for individuals looking to individually improve their lives, but it will never be a sufficient solution to the problems we face in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities, the collective problems we face socially. Johnson goes on to explain that we should think of our participation in social systems like playing out a role in a game. What actions we might take, the rules for how to play, what winning or losing look like, and so on. He states, what happens when people participate in a social system depends on two things: the system and how it works, and what people actually do as they participate in it from one moment to the next. Think of it like what's called win states in a video game. Like the goal, the thing you do in the game to succeed. Imagine for a second that you're playing Helldivers 2. For those who don't know, Helldivers 2 is a multiplayer online collaborative third-person shooter where players control one of a team of 4 soldiers who are dispatched to a location in a war zone to recover a thing or defend a thing or blow up a thing or whatever the mission calls for. The goals and the roles and the rules of the game guiding how you play. So imagine that you're playing the game, right? You're booting it up. You've texted some friends or coworkers that you're jumping on, or maybe you're just going to jump into a quick play session with some strangers. You pick your character's loadout and you drop into a mission. Now maybe you're a real pro gamer, rocket jump, no scope, 360 headshot master player. Or maybe you're more like me and you're a noob and you die several times during a mission. Whatever the case may be, there are right and wrong ways to play. If you call in airstrikes willy-nilly and get other players killed with friendly fire, you'll get kicked from the game. If you're using mods and hacks which cause the game to run like crap or crash, you'll get kicked from the game. You can play like Eric from Internet Common Etiquette and just blatantly team kill the whole time, but if you do, you'll get kicked from the game. So the thought of doing any of those things, they don't even occur to you because that's contrary to the win states the game presents you with. The win states, the paths of least resistance, guide how you'll play, and in the case of Helldivers 2, they guide you towards doing things like trying your best to kill enemies, provide health for injured players, call in respawns for killed players, collect loot, complete mission tasks, and support other players in doing the same. When you're playing the game, it certainly feels like you're acting with free will as you choose what gun to use, what type of airstrike to call down and where, and all that kind of stuff, but all of those choices are guided by the rules and the goals of the game. And this kind of logic affects our behavior in all the systems we engage in, not just in video games, but also board games, and pen and paper games, even card games, games with no pieces whatsoever, so-called hand games like arm wrestling, rock, paper, scissors, quackdelioso, hot hands, none of which I can play, of course, unfortunately. And this is not just about games of all variety, but in life. And I'm not talking about the board game, I mean real life, in all social systems, going to the movies with friends, eating a meal with your family, tackling the dinner rush with your coworkers at the restaurant, everything that you do with everyone, paths of least resistance and rules and roles and structures of social systems determining what you will do. As Johnson puts it, At any given moment, there are an almost infinite number of possible things we could do, but we typically don't realize that and see only a narrow range of possibilities. What the range looks like depends on the system we're in. And understanding how social systems work helps us better address social problems. For example, referring back to how individualist thinking would cause me to think that the term Black Lives Matter was accusing me of racism individually, Johnson explains that we're not individually guilty for systemic problems in society. We shouldn't have white guilt just because we are white in a white supremacist society, if you happen to be white, that is, or whatever privileged status you might occupy. Male guilt for being a man in a patriarchal society, able-bodied guilt for being able-bodied in an ableist society, or whatever the case may be. We shouldn't feel guilty because none of us individually created these social systems that maintain those hierarchies. That's just individualist thinking. Johnson states, by making me aware that I am involved in something larger than myself, sociological practice gets me off the hook of personal guilt and blame for a world that I did not create and that isn't my fault. At the same time, however, it makes me aware of how I choose to participate in that world and how and why those choices matter. I have no reason to feel guilty simply because I'm white, but I also don't have the luxury of thinking that racism and white privilege have nothing to do with me. Building off this idea, Johnson discusses the concept of people getting sick from drinking polluted water, and he uses that to explain how the sociological perspective helps us to solve social problems. See, an individualist look at that problem would say, people are getting sick from drinking polluted water. The solution is to have them drink non-polluted water by buying bottled water, for example. But I'm sure you see that this doesn't fully solve the problem, because not everyone can afford to be buying bottled water all the time. Okay, so let's develop a government program that helps get bottled water to the people who can't afford it. Does that fully solve the problem? It certainly individually does for those individuals, but we want a social solution, something that gets to the root of the problem. So let's ask, why is the water polluted? And trace things back. The people in this community are drinking polluted tap water. Their taps are connected to a system of pipes that lead to a water treatment plant. The water treatment plant is fed water from a nearby aquifer. That aquifer is being polluted by runoff from the local aluminum smelting factory. Well, now we know what to do, right? We have to shut down the factory. Actually, this is just more individualistic thinking, only thinking about the people drinking the water and not the wider interconnected relationships between all the actors involved. Shutting down the factory will stop the water from being polluted, but it'll also cause huge swaths of people to move away, probably destroying the town. Maybe we have to regulate the factory? Well, what if then the factory picks up shop and moves to a town that's more concerned with having good paying jobs in a competitive industry than they are about some lousy old drinkable tap water? Is there even a solution that works for everyone? How will that solution be chosen? How will it be implemented and by who? Now we're getting at institutions, at systems, thinking not just about individuals, but about the relationships between people and how they interact with each other and with these social systems around them. We're now looking at a social problem with a sociological perspective. Johnson concludes the chapter stating, taking the problem to the level of systems doesn't mean we have to ignore individuals. It isn't a matter of one or the other, because sociological practice looks at social life in relation both to systems and to how people participate in them. Chapter 2. Culture, Symbols, Ideas, and the Stuff of Life. Defining culture, Johnson states, I participate in a society that has a culture, and that culture contains words and ideas that people can use to name and interpret what they experience. Most of what we take for reality consists not of things as they really are, but of ideas people have developed about things as they think they are. Essentially, a culture contains a collection of ideas and concepts we use to make sense of the world around us. It is both the material of social life and the concepts of it as well. For example, when my culture has a term like atom or a concept like gender, it provides me with the ability to discuss those things even though I can't see an atom or reach out and touch a gender. And so, like when we were talking about Helldivers 2, if the concepts we use to understand our reality are shaped by our culture, then when I make a choice about something, my options are limited and framed by that culture, our culture providing us with values that guide how we ought to behave, cultural norms which use rewards and punishments to enforce how we must behave. If you want to see this in action, let me tell you a hilarious story from when my camera human was a little What? Why are you giving me that Bro, they don't even know who you are. You're behind the Let me tell you about this story that I heard one time. Totally happened to somebody else, a friend of a friend. I don't even know who it happened to, actually. I feel like this detachment really takes away from the weight of telling this story. Okay, this is a true story. It's about cultural norms, and it goes something like this. There's this young boy who's playing at the beach, but then he leaves these shallow waters he was splashing around in, runs up the hot sand to his family and proclaims, "I have to pee!" wanting one of the adults to chaperone him over to the bathroom. But the adults are all enjoying their day at the beach, lounging around, sunbathing, drinking Zimas, or whatever it is adults did on the beach in the 90s. Whatever the case was, they didn't want to get up and go walk some punk kid over to the bathroom. So, bailing them out of this chore, one of them says, "Just go pee in the ocean like everybody else." "Go pee in the ocean?" the little boy asks, perplexed. "Yeah, just go pee in the ocean. Everybody does it." "I just did it a few minutes ago," his uncle chimes in reassuringly. Now, the little boy knows that peeing in public is a faux pas, even if he doesn't know that term. From potty training, he knows that pee only goes one place, and that's in the toilet. But he's convinced by the adults around him, so he takes their advice, walks on down to the ocean, about knee deep in the water, comfortable distance in, try and act normal, pulls down his swim trunks in the front and begins to relieve himself, imitating the posture and performance that he had done countless times in front of a toilet. However, I'm sure you see where this is going. The other kids at the beach are all pointing and laughing. What a fool the boy is. He's exposing himself in public. He's urinating openly. What an idiot. He's obviously not from around here. Maybe he's mentally ill. This boy is violating cultural norms around nudity and urination, and now he's being mocked for it. The boy, unsurprisingly, turns beet red, and not from a sunburn. In utter shame, he yanks up his trunks, feeling totally bamboozled, hoodwinked, betrayed even, and by his own family no less, and he flees the scene, scurrying back up the beach to his family to scold them for this terrible prank. "You lied! You're not supposed to pee in the ocean!" the boy cries. "How did people know you were peeing?" his mom asks, totally puzzled. "I did what you said. I went out and peed into the ocean," the boy explained, exacerbated. Unsatisfied with his answer, the adults ask exactly what he did when peeing in the ocean. And after detailing the completely normal, totally potty-trained, practically muscle memory act of going pee that he's been instructed to engage in his entire life, his mother interjects, "What? No. You're not supposed to pee into the ocean like that. You're supposed to do it secretly. Go waist deep into the water and go pee while your swim trunks are still on so no one knows what you're doing." "What?" the boy asks, flabbergasted. He knows that you never pee in your clothes. That's what babies do. And he's not a baby. This is clearly just another prank. But again, the boy is reassured by the rest of the family that, in fact, everyone does it. Everyone who has to pee while they're out swimming in the ocean or at a lake or a river, but mostly never at a swimming pool, they go waist deep in the water in front of everyone and intentionally pee into their clothes. Everybody doing it, but pretending not to. And so from that day forward, the boy always followed the culturally acceptable procedure for publicly urinating while swimming. Hey, radical reviewer here in the middle of editing this video. I just wanted to add that I recently brought up this story while hanging out with my camera human and their family, and it turns out that this event took place at a lake, not the ocean, which makes sense, I suppose. For one, a little kid would probably perceive a large lake as basically the ocean if things look bigger when you're a little kid. But more importantly, two, I don't think that the adults in this scenario would have sent a small child alone to face off against crashing ocean waves in an attempt to go pee. Just a funny little clarification, I guess. Anyways, back to the video. The lesson of the story, of course, being that public ridicule, embarrassment, shame, they enforce and maintain cultural norms and behaviors. As Johnson puts it, when someone breaks a rule, they do much more than that, for they also violate a sense of boundaries and raise questions about who they are in relation to an entire system. And of course, we don't exist within only one culture at a time, but many interconnected cultures. I, for example, as you well know, am an avid jaywalker. I'm also a member of the punk genre who is politically an anarchist. Several different cultures with admittedly many overlapping values and norms. In fact, jaywalkers, punks, and anarchists fit quite well together. But not all cultures are so compatible. Johnson states, "Every complex society includes a wide range of socially constructed realities, but some dominate and come to stand for the whole. The result is a kind of internal ethnocentrism, in which diversity and difference are treated as invisible, or when acknowledged at all, are secondary and inferior. Looking at your own life, there's classic examples like medical textbooks which depict white patients, other skin tones not being acknowledged, band-aids that look like white skin, other skin tones not being acknowledged, the pink tax on female versions of essentially gender-neutral products, punishing women for not being men. Chapter 3, The Structures of Social Life. Jumping right in, Johnson states, social structure organizes social life around relationships that connect people to one another and to the systems, as well as connecting entire systems to one another. When I walk into a fast food restaurant, for example, these social structures change my relationship to those around me. I become a guest, a patron to the restaurant, for example. And along with the other patrons, I have motivations which guide my behavior. Motivations around wanting cheap, delicious, safe-to-eat food quickly. And the various staff at the fast food restaurant, they have their own motivations guiding their behavior. Motivations around meeting sales goals, job security, wages, not wanting to get fired, or whatever the case may be. And on a larger scale, the entire restaurant is part of interconnected structures around agribusiness, food and labor regulations, public roads, zoning laws, and things like that. Folks filling roles all up and down these social structures of society. And of course, not everyone in a social system exists on the same footing, with the same status. Defining status, Johnson states, a status is a position in a system's structure, and we participate in a system by occupying one or more statuses in it. If we want to know how people will behave, we're in many ways better off knowing the statuses they occupy than their personal characteristics and intentions. This is a kind of Marxist material analysis kind of thing, like the structures around the fast food restaurant shaping the goals and motivations of the patron and the staff, for example. Speaking of which, as a radical anarchist communist, you probably can understand that I want to live in a society vastly different than the one that I currently live in. You might also assume that I protest and advocate and vote for and work towards bringing about such a society. And because of that, you might further assume that if I worked for a company that was doing some corrupt, illegal, environmentally damaging behavior, that I would quit that job. I would fight for justice. I would expose them. I would go to the press. I would picket their front door. I would stop them from engaging in that behavior. But don't think you know me so well. Do you remember that viral image of the Burger King employee totally illegally dumping grease down the storm drain in the parking lot? Well, that was me. Not really, no. But I was in a very similar predicament back when I worked at Jack in the Box in the late 2000s. You see, initially, the restaurant I worked at had a grease dumpster for dumping old grease, as many restaurants have. I'm sure you've probably seen them before. But the place I worked at, they wanted to update their system to one where they had 2 large vats in the dry storage area, connected by nozzles to the side of the building. So a truck could just simply drive up to the store, hook the hose up to the side of the building, pump in new grease to one vat, and suck the old grease out from the adjacent vat. Here comes the problem. They got rid of the grease dumpster before the new way of disposing old grease was fully set up. Their solution? The maintenance employee, me, was asked to illegally dump old grease down the slop sink in the back. Doing exactly what the Burger King employee did, but, doing it behind closed doors. Now, I refused to illegally dump grease down the drain in accordance with my values, and I wasn't fired for that since I was being asked to do something illegal anyway. Instead, when it came time for the old grease to be done away with, I would gather it all up into a giant pot, and then a different employee, or the manager, would do the actual dumping of the grease while I stood there doing nothing. If I remember correctly, several gallons of grease was dumped illegally this way every day for about 2 weeks until the new system was fully installed. And here is where the sociological analysis comes in. According to my values, my moral system, you might assume that I would have done more than simply refusing to engage in the illegal environmental destruction. I should have reported the illegal activity, secretly filmed it and exposed them, gone to the press, gone to the EPA, fought for environmental justice against this evil destruction. And I tried to do some of that, kind of. I went to the Environmental Protection Agency website and I tried to see if there's like a forum where I could make some kind of anonymous report. But I was a young pup in the late 2000s. I was in college at the time. I had a long distance relationship I was struggling to maintain. I needed the job to pay for bus fare and rent and school books and things like that. I had a lot going on. Not only that, the bureaucratic EPA website, the forms, they were all just too confusing for me to wrap my head around given everything I had going on at the time. I wasn't about to waste my time trying to solve this stupid problem that might end up getting me fired anyway. Long story short, although my morals, my ethics dictate a more severe response to this situation, the social structures I existed in, being a student, being young, the forms being complicated, needing the job, and so on, those things applied pressure to my behavior. They limited and shaped the paths of least resistance. And so, you, as an outside observer, if you had to guess what I, a radical anarchist, would do if I was asked to dump gallons of old grease down the drain, you would be better off knowing the statuses I occupied in the social structures I was a part of than understanding my internal ethical beliefs. That's not to say that it's impossible to change people's mind or change their behavior, but think about what it takes to change those things at the individual level. Long, persistent challenges to their beliefs and behaviors. And as we saw, people's material conditions are a much better determiner of their behavior. So if we really want to change people's beliefs and behaviors, we need systemic changes to their material conditions, thus altering their paths of least resistance. We have to change the win states of how the game is played, such as improving regulations and oversight around the illegal dumping of old grease, for example. Expanding further on this concept of status, Johnson states, some statuses are ascribed to us at birth, such as race, gender, ethnicity, and family statuses, such as daughter. Others we achieve and occupy as we move through our lives, such as student, clerk, plumber, lawyer, manager, teacher, soldier, wife, husband, life partner, mother, father, divorced, step-parent. And further than this, these ascribed statuses and many of these achieved statuses, they're with us whether we're currently participating in them or not. You're always whatever race you are while watching this video, even if you're watching it alone or in a group. If you're watching this video at home or in the bathroom at work or whatever the case may be. You're always a child to your parents, whether you live with them and see them all the time or you haven't talked to them since Thanksgiving. But there's also situational statuses that you only occupy when you are participating in them. For example, if you walk to a fast food restaurant, you are a pedestrian. And when you enter the fast food restaurant, you're no longer a pedestrian, you're now a customer. And when you leave the restaurant, you're no longer a customer, you go back to being a pedestrian. Describing this further, Johnson states, the point of occupying a status is that it connects us to social systems and provides us with paths of least resistance that shape how we experience and participate in those systems. It does this with a set of cultural ideas known as a role. A role is a collection of beliefs, values, attitudes, and norms that apply to whoever occupies a particular status in relation to whoever occupies other statuses in the system. If you are within the status of pedestrian, there are expectations that you will fulfill that role correctly in relation to other pedestrians and to vehicles and buildings and such. You'll use the sidewalk, you'll wait at the crosswalk, and so on. You'll be ridiculed and even face legal challenges if you go against the paths of least resistance. If you stop to pee or even take a crap in the middle of crossing the street, not unlike the boy openly peeing into the ocean, cars will honk at you. People will point and laugh at you. They'll probably film you with their phones. The cops might be called. Everyone will assume that you must be mentally unwell or on drugs. Videos of your behavior are gonna go viral on social media. All because you're breaking social norms around the role and rules of being a pedestrian. I, on the other paw, as a dog, have different expectations placed on me when I'm fulfilling the role of pedestrian. I can take a crap at any point during my walk around town, even if I'm blocking the middle of the street and the lights changed and people in cars are trying to get where they're going. The people might be irritated with my crap, pun intended, but they will put up with it nonetheless because I will still be acting within my role as a dog. Let's say we had a problem with this system though. Let's say that dog crap was being left willy-nilly all over the place and it was unsanitary and an annoyance. Well, Johnson argues, if we want to change pervasive social patterns of abusive behavior, we have to see how those patterns are connected to paths of least resistance and how people choose whether to follow them. You see, social systems, they don't always promote what they intend to. In ye olden Charles Dickinson days, people probably didn't want crap all over the streets, and yet it was there because high population density and access to internal plumbing hadn't quite dealt with the fact that when you gotta go, you gotta go. But with time, structures and rules were established to address this. Every home and restaurant and store got a toilet. Waste management systems were set up and things like that. But the system isn't always perfect. Let's imagine you are out on the town and you don't have your wallet with you, and you really have to go. Hopefully, the path of least resistance guides you to a toilet. Maybe there's a grocery store and they have a toilet, but there's a door code and the employee won't let you have it. He keeps saying restrooms are for customers only, and you keep saying I don't have my wallet. And you think about maybe you should threaten the employee or tell them you're going to crap on the floor and they're going to have to clean it up if they don't give you that door code right now. But there's a lot of roles and expectations around being a patron at a grocery store, and you see the employee eyeballing the security guy, you think better of it and you leave. Okay, well, you can't crap in the middle of the street because, you're a human and you'll get mocked and the police will be called and all that stuff we already established. So, with no socially acceptable or legal avenues left to you, you duck down an alley and crap next to some dumpster or whatever. The point of the story is that society has created systems and structures and laws in such a way to create paths of least resistance, which greatly reduce the amount of crap in the streets compared to Charles Dickens' times. But sometimes these systems break down and paths of least resistance lead to taking a crap in the alley. As Johnson puts it, the combination of shared values and an unequal distribution of opportunities makes people more similar in what they're encouraged to want than in their ability to get what they want in socially acceptable ways. High crime rates happen because people don't have what others around them have and what their culture says they should have. Or as Karl Marx famously put it in Wage, Labor, and Capital, a house may be large or small. As long as the neighboring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirement for a residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. The occupant of the relatively little house will always find himself more uncomfortable, more dissatisfied, more cramped within his four walls. Chapter 4: Population and Human Ecology. People, Space, and Place. Starting with population, Johnson explains that simply changing the number of participants in any system, all else staying the same, this will greatly change how that system functions. I'm sure you've noticed that a game of Monopoly with 2 players plays out very differently than a game with 8 players. A classroom with 15 students functions very differently than a lecture hall of 60 people. And on a large scale, a country that loses half of its population to the bubonic plague or has a huge baby boom after a world war, that's a country that's about to go through some huge changes. As Johnson puts it, most sociologists see social life as primarily a matter of culture, social structures, and the interconnection through which people participate in systems. But this view leaves out the fact that social life always happens someplace and involves some number of people. When thinking of the space and place aspect of this, I always think of the Marxist concept of base and superstructure, where the superstructure is referring to the rules of a social system, the rules of monopoly, the job titles and tasks of the employees at a restaurant, for example. Whereas the base refers to the physical structures of the system, the Monopoly game board and the pieces and the fake money, or the various restaurant equipment, the ovens and the grills and the cutlery or whatever. Basically, when talking about space and place, or even base, we're talking about the brick and mortar, the physical elements of a social system. Seeing how this plays out in action, Johnson states, every social situation has an ecological angle. Typical classrooms, for example, are arranged to reinforce the teacher's authority by facing students' chairs towards the front so that it's harder for the students to interact with one another than with the teacher. In courtrooms and churches, judges and clergy are typically elevated above everyone else in a physical arrangement that underscores and reinforces differences in power and status. This leads us to what Johnson calls human ecology, which is the blend of these two concepts: the people of the social system, their number and their location, and the brick and mortar of the social system, the buildings and the tools and whatnot. On the smallest scale, think about how families used to do everything together in one room, doing some needlepoint, reading a book, writing some poetry or whatever, around the warmth of the fireplace. But with floorboard heaters or central air or whatever, and technological advancements like computers, TVs, and smartphones, and people stopped hanging out collectively around the fireplace. Now they hang out all over the house, sometimes secluded in their own rooms. The physical structure and the physical objects of the house changing how family members interact from day to day. And on a larger scale, I'm sure that you learned in school about how cities drastically changed in the early 1900s. They went from wealthy people living within the city so they could easily get to work, and they worked on the bottom floor of the buildings where it was safer. But as cars became more mainstream and steel framed buildings and safer elevators became the norm, everything flipped. Wealthy people lived in the suburbs outside of the city. They drove to work, where they worked on the upper floors of the buildings with nice big windowed offices. And this kind of change exists on a global scale as well. A country with large oil reserves and no coastline is going to be very different from a country with no oil reserves and a large coastline, for example. The number of people in a social system and the shape and the layout of the physical structures of that social system greatly determining how it functions. Chapter 5. Us, It, and Social Interaction. To start, Johnson states, social systems don't happen without us, and in important ways, we don't happen without them. We live as thinking, acting beings, yet the stuff that thoughts are made of and the meaning our actions have make sense only in relation to cultural, structural, and ecological aspects of social systems. And he discusses how when we were young, we probably thought everyone's lives were basically the same as our own, a very egocentric view of reality. But with time, we began to understand our lives as unique and separate from others. Maybe you remember being like a little kid at a family member's house or a friend's house, and you went off to get a snack from the kitchen, and you noticed that their food was totally different than what you had at home. And you get that sonder feeling of realizing that everyone has a individual life, and you come to have a deeper understanding of the culture and the society around you as you piece together what roles are available to you and how you will best fit within them. Again, not unlike the boy learning how to properly pee in the ocean. As Johnson puts it, when we occupy a status, the role that goes with it provides us with a ready-made self that we can adopt as a path of least resistance toward acceptance by others. In this sense, most people don't know much about who we are on the inside. What they know consists primarily of cultural images of the typical person who occupies this or that status. The typical girl, the typical student, the typical lawyer, the typical business manager. In social space, we aren't who we are in some absolute objective sense. We are who people think we are, a reality of us they construct from cultural ideas before they ever know anything about us based on direct experience. I'm sure there's been countless times in your life where you experimented with and then eventually adopted various cultural signifiers of this or that role in society. Maybe you did dark makeup sometimes, dyed your hair black, before eventually deciding to go full goth. Maybe you switched out a graphics card or a motherboard on a computer before eventually becoming a full-blown PC gamer. Maybe you did some work on your first car, took an auto mechanics class in high school before becoming a full-on gearhead. Adopting the mannerisms, clothing, occupation, jargon, things that signal what role you are inhabiting. And of course, no one becomes goth or a PC gamer or a gearhead by inventing those personalities themselves out of thin air. They do so by watching and interacting with those around them, people who mirror and reflect different types of people to us, what Johnson calls significant others, stating, significant others are specific people who act like mirrors, reflecting images back to us that we may incorporate into our sense of who we are. But before we interact with someone enough for them to become a significant other in this way, they're first a generalized other, someone we interact with based only on our limited understanding of their role in society. For example, before becoming the full-on jaywalking punk anarchist you know and love today, back when I was a young pup experimenting with who I was gonna grow up to be, my understanding of punk was very superficial, generalized. The punks I knew consisted of the songs and the clothing options in Tony Hawk games or at the Hot Topic at the mall. Superficial, surface level stuff. But then, as I made friends with fellow punks in my area and I started going to shows and befriending folks that are in bands, starting and joining bands myself, a lot of these folks becoming significant others who helped me to learn about and understand this role called punk. We use these understandings of generalized others, significant others, the roles around us, to understand ourselves and our place in society. As Johnson puts it, we use a variety of techniques to have our performances seem as authentic, as worthy of whatever role we're playing, as convincing enough for us to be accepted in that situation for who it is we claim to be. So, we usually make an effort to show up looking the part. wearing the right clothes, having the right attitude for that situation, knowing our lines, carrying the right props. Basically the opposite of, how do you do, fellow kids? Johnson continues. If I play a role in a way that seems to contradict who I think I am, the person playing that role is still me, and no less me than the me who rejects this as not being the real me. Like, I hate to say it, but the me that didn't report the fast food restaurant for illegally dumping old grease down the drain, that's just as much my authentic self as the me who feels like a chump for not adhering to my values. And Johnson concludes the chapter stating, we are objects of culture, described, valued, and limited by its ideas about who we are and how we ought to think, feel, and behave. We're the ones who make culture our own, so that we often can't tell the point where it leaves off and we begin, or if that point exists at all. Both us making culture and, in turn, culture making us. And of course, these various roles exist along stratified hierarchies. Perhaps you remember reading The Outsiders in school, where the whole moral of the story is about the different ways society treats the various roles, the preppy kids compared to the greaser kids in the story. Or maybe you read To Kill a Mockingbird in school, where there's code switching, there's systemic racism in the story showing roles and cultural hierarchies on full display. Chapter 6, Living the Practice and the Promise. Thinking big, Johnson asks, why is there poverty in society? And he answers this question thusly. In the drive for profit, for example, capitalism places a high value on competition and efficiency. This motivates companies and their managers to control costs by keeping wages as low as possible and replacing people with machines or replacing full-time workers with part-time workers. It makes it a rational choice to move jobs to regions or countries where labor is cheaper and workers are less likely to complain about poor working conditions, or where laws protecting the natural environment from industrial pollution or workers from injuries on the job are weak or unenforced. Which might remind you of a passage from when we discussed Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels.
Engels then points to a crisis in capitalism that has become increasingly important in our modern day: machinery and automation. He states, machinery becomes the most powerful weapon in the war of capital against the working class, that the instruments of labor constantly tear the means of subsistence out of the hands of the laborer, that the very product of the worker is turned into an instrument for his subjugation.
And thinking about solutions to this poverty, Johnson puts on his sociologist glasses and states, public debate about poverty and policies to deal with it focuses almost entirely on how people participate, with almost nothing to say about the system they participate in. What generally pass for liberal and conservative approaches to poverty are in fact two variations on the same narrow theme of individualism. Johnson continues. Welfare and other anti-poverty programs are social only in the sense that they're organized around the idea that social systems, such as government, have a responsibility to do something about poverty. But anti-poverty programs are not organized around a sociological understanding of how systems produce poverty in the first place. As a result, they focus almost entirely on changing individuals and not systems, and they use the resources of governments and other systems to make it happen. And if any of that sounds familiar, it's probably because you're thinking about that time we discussed The Soul of Man Under Socialism by Oscar Wilde. Let's roll that clip.
We often pat ourselves on the back for our modern amenities and social safety nets, our soup kitchens and homeless shelters and food stamps and school lunches for little children and all the rest. But we aren't really ensuring a society where people thrive. Just a society where they probably won't starve to death. Or as Wilde puts it, this is not a solution, it is an aggravation of the difficulty. The proper aim is to try to reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty will be impossible.
Again, if you want to change how the participants in a social system act, you don't address their behavior, you address the paths of least resistance that guided their behavior. You change the win states of the game in order to change how people play it. And Johnson concludes the chapter stating, liberals and conservatives are locked in a tug of war between two individualistic solutions to problems that are only partly about individuals. Both approaches rest on profound misunderstandings of what makes a problem like poverty social. Neither is informed by a sense of how social life actually works as a dynamic relationship between social systems and how people participate in those systems. And finally, Chapter 7, A Simple Framework for a Complicated World. This chapter is about using this sociological perspective to understand our complicated world. For example, what the heck is going on with systemic racism? Well, Johnson states, cultural ideas can come into being as a way to justify structural arrangements, and how those same ideas can go on to play a role in shaping other systems in various ways. A system's structural, cultural, population, ecological characteristics can load the odds in ways that create paths of least resistance, but the rest depends on what people choose to do from one moment to the next. As an example, Johnson discusses how his own life benefited from a history of white supremacy. His family bought some farmland in Connecticut, which had been stolen from the Ho-Chunk tribe. Then his parents used the money they inherited from the sale of that farm, along with the help of an FHA loan, which was disproportionately given to white families. They used that money to buy a house. And when Johnson himself bought a house, he did so with a loan from his parents. Intergenerational wealth gained from a society that benefited white families at the expense of non-white families. Sure, paths of least resistance can, through culture, appear logical, normal, something that we do without even thinking, but by understanding systems of power and oppression, we can be mindful of those paths and even challenge them. As Johnson puts it, collectively, the white population of the United States now holds an enormous unearned advantage of wealth and power, regardless of what kind of people we are as individuals. And he adds, there is no moment of greater awareness for anyone than when they step off the path of least resistance and pee directly into the ocean and crap in the street. No, that's not what he says. Okay. Johnson adds, there is no moment of greater awareness for anyone than when they step off the path of least resistance. There is also no moment of greater potential to make a difference. Changing the way a system happens is a far more powerful and potentially more dangerous strategy than trying to change individuals one at a time. And Johnson ends the text reflecting on a recent walk he had, where he was walking in the night and a woman was walking towards him. And as she approached, she made a big arch around him, shuddered, and averted her gaze. And he thought, okay, well, I wasn't going to hurt this woman or anything, but there's patriarchy. There's a prevalence of sexual violence. It's dark out. He thought about his role and his existence in a hierarchical, patriarchal society. And he concludes the text stating, no experience, no action is complete unto itself. Everything is fundamentally relational. The global economy isn't just about nations and flows of capital. It's also about families and communities and neighborhoods and job prospects and stress and arguments over the dinner table. A large-scale problem like poverty is not only about how individuals choose to live, but it's also about the systems they participate in that shape the alternatives from which they choose and the paths of least resistance they are encouraged to follow. Conclusion. So that's it. A very long-winded look back at the first book I ever discussed on this channel many, many moons ago. If I were to somehow really chop things down, really summarize this almost 200-page book, this 20-page script, down to one quote from the text, I think it would be this. It is a basic tenet of sociological practice that to solve a social problem, we have to begin by seeing it as social. Without this, we look in the wrong places for explanations and in the wrong direction for visions of change. And that's just it, isn't it? We can't tackle any of the problems we discuss on this channel, racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, inequality, patriarchy, cis heteronormativity, and all those other woke cringe terms. I mean, these social issues in society. We can't save the world without understanding these problems as social problems, as something that exists not within individuals, but in between individuals, in the roles and cultures and social systems with which we live. So, maybe with this sociological perspective under your belt, or maybe it's like sociological perspective glasses, since it's about seeing things a certain way, whatever the case may be. Hopefully with this sociological way of seeing and thinking about social problems in the world, you will now look in the right places for explanations about these problems in society, and you'll look in the right direction for visions of change. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. You've allowed me to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support. Gotta love you for that. You provide me with a little extra funds for books and dog toys and things like that, which I really appreciate a lot. And if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
So please, the next time you're smashing the state, don't go breaking my heart. But I know that we can pick up the pieces and build something new, something different. That's not like every revolution that I've ever known. That can make me believe it, have faith in humanity. That we'll all be the breath of fresh air.
If you're interested in radical theory, looking for book recommendations or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here at the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.